Hello, I'm San Francisco Mayor London Breed. As a proud graduate of the University of San Francisco, I'm excited to join you all here today for this Black History Month celebration. Part of the reason I chose to attend USF was its strong history of being deeply committed to diversity, racial justice, and ethical leadership. As one of the first fully integrated universities in the United States, for me and many others who attended USF, higher education is what opens doors of opportunity for us to become leaders and create change in our own communities. The young people studying at USF today will be the leaders of tomorrow, and one of them may even become the next mayor of San Francisco. That is why it's so important that we remain committed to providing quality education for young people in our city, especially African American youth, regardless of their background or income level. That is how we will ensure all communities have a seat at the table when important decisions and policies are being made. Now I have the honor of introducing today's keynote conversation with two icons of the civil rights movement. Today, as we see the Black Lives Matter movement sparking change across our country, they can provide insight and wisdom for future generations to continue the work our ancestors began so long ago. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Clarence B Jones, who served as legal counsel, strategic advisor, and draft speechwriter for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and is the co-founder and founding director emeritus of the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice, and Ambassador Andrew J. Young, who has served as a member of Congress, the first African-American U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and mayor of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also proud to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Mary Wardell of USF. Before we hear from our honored guests, we have a special award presentation for Ambassador Young. As we celebrate Black History Month this year, we must continue to be relentless in doing the hard work to make sure real change for racial and economic justice occurs. Thank you for joining us here today.
Hello. Thank you so much to Mayor London Breed, who's been such a tremendous support to the University of San Francisco. I'm Jonathan Greenberg, Director of the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco. It's my honor to welcome all of you to this extraordinary event. Thank you so much for joining us for this special occasion. I now introduce Dr. Mary J. Wardell, the Vice Provost for Diversity, Engagement, and Community Outreach at USF. Dr. Wardell is a treasure in our community with a deep understanding of the necessity for inclusivity, justice, and love in our organizations and in our country. Dr. Wardell.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It is such a gift and a pleasure for me to be here today with these two icons of racial, political, and social justice. Before we begin, we're going to jump into some questions that will help us understand their lives with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, as well as their lives and how that experience of walking with Dr. King has impacted them. I've invited both Ambassador Young as well as Dr. Jones to open up this space in many ways that they would have when they were leading the movement, but also as part of the historic tradition of the Black church and how song and music is tied integrally to these ideas of social justice. And so Ambassador Young, as well as Dr. Jones, will you join me in this freedom song, I Woke Up This Morning with My Mind, okay? All right.
Okay, you're gonna start it?
I'll start it, okay?
All right.
I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. 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 Well, we know there's a lot more verses where that song can go, but hopefully, yeah, you can go on forever. But wherever you're at right now in the world, Ambassador Young, thank you for joining us from your office and home in Atlanta. And thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for being here with us from your home office in Palo Alto. So we are going to, I'm going to share some prelude to bring us into this first set of questions and try to also bring the audience along with us. So in the late 1950s, Ambassador Young, you heard the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King give a sermon in Tallahassee, and you met him at Talladega College in South Georgia before you got involved with Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC. And in 1957, Ambassador, you moved to New York with the National Council of Churches. In your book, and you have several books, but in your book, An Easy Burden, you recall how Dr. King's close advisor, Stanley Levitson, came to see him in 1961 to recruit him to work with Dr. King and the SCLC. So Ambassador Young, it would be really wonderful, and as we begin this time we have together, just to share your first memory of when you first met with Dr. Jones, because the two of you are going to be in conversation as these kind of close confidants to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So tell us about your first memory in meeting Dr. Jones. What do you remember about him specifically?
Well, I remember being feeling inadequate. I mean, remember, Dr. King had already established a tremendous reputation all around the world. And he had, on the cover of Time magazine at least once, and Ebony 2 or 3 times, between Ebony and Jet. And I knew of Clarence Jones. Clarence sort of used to hang out also with Harry Belafonte, whom I did not know. But these people were stars, you know, and I was a country preacher who had just been in New York a little while, trying to find my way. And I really did not feel adequate to the task of even working with Martin Luther King. And I just really didn't feel up to it. And so I knew, well, I don't know what I knew, but shortly after that, after meeting Lim,
yes,
the first showing of the Nashville sit-in story came on. And I had met Martin at Talladega College, and I had been to Highlander Folk School and Fisk, and I knew a lot of the students, and I really admired and looked up to them. And we had just bought a house in Queens, and we were looking at this Nashville sit-in story, and my wife, who was from Marion, Alabama,
Mm-hmm.
the same little town that Coretta King came from.
Uh-huh.
In fact, they went to the same high school. She just says out of the clear blue, it's time for us to go home.
Wow.
And I said, we are home. We just bought this house.
Yeah.
She said, sell it. And I said, well, what am I going to do for a job? And I didn't want to work with Martin Luther King directly
Mm-hmm.
because my conception of the movement, and it was not far from accurate, was a gathering of young, ambitious, egotistical Baptist preachers.
Uh-huh.
And I'm a member of the Congregational Church.
Mm-hmm.
So we are not viewed as good preachers. And, you know, there's a lot of little competition. And, well, it's just not something I felt I wanted to get involved in. But when Jean said we have to go home, she insisted that I quit my job. We put the house up for sale and it sold in 2 weeks.
Wow.
But she was pregnant and had about another month to go before her master's thesis was due at Queens College.
I see.
And so I quit my job and we put the house up for sale and it was gone. And I was looking at going to Highlander Folk School in Tennessee because I wanted to be with the movement, in the movement, but I didn't want to be in the midst of that politics of the church. Remember, this was when Martin Luther King himself had been expelled from the National Baptist Convention.
Yes.
I mean, that this wasn't a popular thing.
Interesting. It wasn't popular. And I want our listening audience, the ones that are live and the ones that will listen to this after it, what you just said, Ambassador, how unpopular the movement actually was at that particular time. So we're trying to weave a story and that you can tell and Clarence can help tell as well, so that people could understand, because we're gonna make connections to the present day later in this interview. Dr. Jones, what was the consequence of your first meeting, Ambassador Young? Can you recall your first time that you met him?
Well, I can recall the generality, not all the details.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I liked about, the thing that initially attracted me to Andy was that he was not a Baptist preacher. Now, that was the greatest thing that was the greatest plus in my mind, that he was not part of that. He was a little removed, and he was related to the National Council of Churches. So I thought he had a national constituency, and he looked and sounded like the perfect kind of quote preacher in quotes that need to come to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Because the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was a conference of Baptist preachers and their little fiefdoms, of egos. And, it was formed to save the soul of America in 1959. And you have to understand, it consisted of preachers, each of whom had their own pulpits and churches.
Something happened, I lost it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, well, we can still hear you, Ambassador Young.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference consists of ego preachers with each of their own churches and pulpits. And I guess out of common denominator of an enormous respect for Martin. You know, they would agree to have him be, quote, their leader. But I felt that it was precisely because Andy did not come from among them
Yes, yes.
that he would be good.
That's so great. I want to talk a little bit about some of the women that were important in the movement. And I want to spend a little time on Ms. Dorothy Cotton. Ambassador Young, you began your work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, leading the citizenship schools together with Ms. Cotton, who was also very close to Dr. Jones until her death in 2018. For those that may not know who Dorothy is, she was a confidant of Martin Luther King and was the only woman in his inner circle of aides. And she marched in the perilous civil rights demonstrations. And she was a driving force in getting Southern Black people to vote. Ambassador Young, can you share your memories, feelings about Ms. Cotton?
Well, Dorothy Cotton was a feminist before feminism was cool. And she really, she had completed her master's degree and was teaching at Virginia State University, and was really an assistant, a volunteer working with Wyatt Walker, who did come down to be the executive director and brought Dorothy with him. Dorothy was the director of the education program, which was working with Highlander Folk School and Mrs. Septima Clark. And Septima Clark was from Charleston, South Carolina, and had been fired from her teaching job simply because she was a member of the NAACP. And when they asked her, she said yes, and she showed her a membership card, and she got fired. Well, the Marshall Field Foundation gave her a grant, and she developed a reading program to teach the longshoremen who were working in the Charleston port area to read and write to register to vote. You had to pass a literacy test, and it wasn't a matter of being able to read or write. It was knowing all of the you almost had to have a law degree.
Yes.
But she started teaching. She would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and get on the ferry going from Johns Island to Charleston. And there was about an hour ferry ride, and she turned it into a reading lesson every morning.
Yes.
And so Dorothy was working with her, and Highlander Folk School got closed because they accused this 65-year-old woman of carrying 21 gallons of moonshine out in 2 suitcases. And they said she wasn't teaching there, she was running a bootlegging operation. And but that's what pulled me in, because I went to the United Church of Christ in New York, and because the Congregational Church really had 500 schools and colleges across the South.
Yes.
And so in North Carolina and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tougaloo College, they had property.
Yes.
And so I went to them and said, can we use your properties that are not being used to run this literacy program with Septima Clark? And they said, yes, we'll be glad to fix them up. Any of them that you want, we'll pay to restore them. But you need to go down and sort of be our link to the civil rights movement. So I had the best of both worlds. SCLC did not have tax exemption,
Yes.
and the church did. So I came to SCLC really with a separate budget, which gave me a lot of independence, too much, most people thought. And but it also it also made it possible for me to work without competing for attention. In fact, I didn't even know. I didn't talk to Dr. King at all, hardly. But we ended up with an office right across the hall from his.
Yes.
And his secretary said that I was in Atlanta alone. My wife had the baby and went to Alabama with her mother. And she said that you shouldn't be running loose in Atlanta.
But
She said, idle minds, the devil's workshop. So would you mind helping to answer some of Dr. King's mail? Well,
wow.
I said, sure, be honored. And she gave me a great big egg crate of just packed with letters, thousands of letters.
Wow.
And so I was living at the YMCA. So every night I would try my hand at answering letters written to Martin Luther King as though I was writing for Martin Luther King.
And you were responding in as you best could through his voice.
Exactly.
Wow.
And I had, we had been in college pretty much the same time. I went to Howard and he went to Morehouse. But both of our presidents had been visitors in India at the Indian independence and had met Mahatma Gandhi. So it was a pretty similar curriculum.
That's wonderful.
And so I could put myself in his position and answer those questions for him. And without really knowing him, I knew him. I mean, his wife was from the same little country town my wife was from.
Mhm.
I knew more about her than I knew about him. And they had really rough experiences growing up. I mean, Coretta's house was burned down when she was 15. And there was just because her daddy had a nice house.
Mm.
And even though he was a sharecropper, he was a brilliant man. And he had raised his daughters. When she came home from choir practice and saw that the house was burned down, the first thing her father did was make them hold hands and kneel down and thank God that none of them were in the house.
Yes.
And then he made them ask God's forgiveness for the sick people who burned down the house. And then he prayed that they would never hold any bitterness.
Yes.
And so now that was country nonviolence. That didn't come from Gandhi. That came from Jesus.
And I love how you tell that story, because we can link it to the violence and the resentment that we see even in 2021, right, Ambassador? And
Exactly.
A lot of times, we think that as individuals, but, you start to see what I call racialized violence and resentment. It really is a form of almost like a spiritual sickness, right?
Well, it is.
And
that's the way I was taught.
mhm.
I grew up in New Orleans, and my father told me that the Nazi party was on the corner of my house, 50 yards from where I was born. He said, look, those are white supremacists. And white supremacy is a sickness. and you don't get angry with sick people, and you kind of stay out of their way, but you don't get mad, and you don't let them get you upset.
Yeah.
And so that I learned, and actually at 4, because it was 1936, and to demonstrate how to get along with white supremacists, he took me to the movies to see Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. And when Hitler walked out, rather than give Jesse Owens his gold medal, my father said, now see, he could get upset about that. But if he got upset about that, it would interfere with his performance. He said, the hell with Hitler. He kept his mind on his races, and he just went on and won 3 more gold medals.
I love it. Yeah, Jesse is so important.
And that was the message, that with which I was raised. In fact, all of us in the South. Don't get mad, get smart.
Love it.
If you lose your temper, you lose your fight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ambassador Young, for sharing that story and giving us depth also around Ms. Cotton's work.
That's right. But now Dorothy was out of the same kind of background, except that she was unusually confident, articulate, beautiful, and I mean, she was a bad sister, and she knew it.
That I love that.
And in a staff meeting, I remember once Dr. King said, "Dorothy, would you mind getting me a cup of coffee?" And she turned to me. She said, "Andy, get your boss a cup of coffee."
I love it.
The women don't get. I said, women don't get coffee anymore.
Yeah, long line of feminists that I'm a part of too. Dr. Jones, tell us a little bit about, before we move on to our next thing, I just wanted you to share on your reflections of Ms. Cotton, because I do think it's important for our listening audience to understand the role, particularly the role of Black women in this movement.
Well, Dorothy had a profound impact on me, because she's the one that said to Martin in my presence, Martin, I have such respect for Clarence and Stanley Levison and so forth, but I watched Clarence. He's not capable of nonviolence. and he just doesn't have the capacity to do it. He's got that, he's got too much of that male masculinity and anger at him. So we've got to keep him in the rear lines, because he in fact, and I said to her, I said, yeah, you're right. I agree. I do not have the capacity to be nonviolent like you and the others. And so Martin says, well, Clarence, we got to keep you in a way where you don't have to embarrass us. I said, not going to be any embarrassment. I said, white policeman hits me, he's going down. He says, that's what I mean.
Well, that's not true either, though.
What's that?
You see, never in the movement did one white man hit one Black man.
Oh, I understand that.
So, but when I got hit, it was about 200 white men and me. And in that situation, if you want to stay alive, you get nonviolent.
I hear you. I hear you make a distinction. But anyway, I was just making Dorothy made an early assessment for a whole combination of reasons. She was very respectful for my skill sets and so forth, but just believed that.
Well, you had connections.
What?
You had connections in Washington.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Adam Clayton Powell was still a big man in Washington.
Yeah.
But you also had Wall Street connections.
Yeah.
And you had, I don't know whether you knew, well, you knew Harry Belafonte before Martin did.
So my next question is going to actually be lead really well with what Ambassador Young's comments, because I want you to pick up on this. Dr. Jones, as well as Ambassador Young, both of you were tasked by Dr. King to negotiate with members of the white business and political power structure of the time in various cities and throughout the government. Can you talk about this process that both of you had in your leadership capacities and any times you worked together?
Well, let me
navigating, negotiating those communities.
First of all, you got to remember what our objective was. It wasn't about ego. Our objective was to achieve what we were seeking to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And getting back to Andy again, I felt that it is precisely because of Andy's background coming from the National Council of Churches, being a little removed from what I call the ego thing of Baptist preachers, that he had a way of looking and dealing with other people, particularly other people in the religious profession,
Mm-hmm.
different than Baptist preachers. And the best compliment I can say about Andy is that he knew to keep the eyes on the prize. You know, he knew he had a combination of intuitiveness, smarts, and experience. And it carried over. I mean, there's all the little petty rivalries, you know. As I said, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was a conference of various Baptist preachers with their own churches. And they're each seeking to get they were knights seeking to get the king's approval. This king being the real king, Dr. King, you know. And so a lot of it, misunderstand me. It was totally commitment driven. They were some committed brothers, but you know, they were.
Well, take Fred Shuttlesworth.
Yeah, right. Good example.
See,
right?
Fred Shuttlesworth was one of the toughest, smartest, aggressive men I know. And he went around looking for trouble.
That's right.
And he was the kind that would go to a class, to a Klan meeting and know he was going there and take people with him just to provoke them. And when they decided that the 54 Supreme Court decision was released when his children got to be school age, he didn't wait for lawyers or anything else. He just sort of took them to school. And he got beat up doing it. And that didn't stop him. He just kept on going. Now, I grew up, he grew up basically in an all-Black community. I happened to grow up in a community that in New Orleans, lifestyles are different. And there was an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another, the Nazi party on the third corner, and a Chevrolet dealership around the fourth corner. And I'm living right in the middle. So I was comfortable dealing with white folk. I had been taught to deal with white folk since I was 4. See, and that took it was the way my father also taught me to box.
Mm-hmm.
And he say, if you know how to fight, you don't have to fight. But if you don't know how to fight, people are gonna pick on you. So if you know how to fight, you don't have to fight but once. And they'll make sure they know you're in a fight. They've been in a fight. And so he was, all the boxers in the neighborhood would come. He was a dentist, and he'd come and fix their teeth and sew up their eyes when they got bruised. And they never had any money. So he said, well, you take my boys to the gym and you teach them to fight. So,
Dental work in exchange for boxing lessons.
yeah. And now my daddy's message was, don't fight.
Mhm.
My grandmother's message is, if somebody calls you or your brother nigger and you don't fight, you will get a whipping when you get home.
You know,
And so it was, I mean, that was the typical Southern survival skills in my neighborhood.
yeah.
But that meant that when I came into the movement, I had also been with the National Council of Churches,
Mhm.
where I was the only two Black executives out of 600.
Mm.
See, and so when we went to Birmingham, Dr. King said, Andy, don't you know some white folks here? I said, no, I really don't. I don't believe I know any. And he said, well, see if you can get to know some. Because one of the things we did before we started demonstrating, we started a negotiation process. And it just so happened that I had been at a conference in Michigan where the Episcopal Church was represented.
Mhm.
And so I took a chance and called this Episcopal Church and asked if they remembered this kind of conference. And it turned out that the lady had been at the conference and remembered meeting me. And she set up the meeting with the Episcopal bishop. And then I got him to get some businessmen together
Mhm.
to meet with Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and
They introduced us to
Reverend
C.
Shuttleworth.
Andy,
What's that?
they introduced us to C. Erskine Smith, the county attorney, the city attorney.
Yeah.
So,
No, he was, I didn't meet him until later.
Okay.
and so what
Uh,
you're sharing with us, Ambassador Young, is the power
Charles Morgan,
of
did you meet him,
network.
Andy? Charles Morgan?
huh?
Did you meet Charles Morgan?
Yeah, Charles Morgan. And, but that was the end. They came in
At the end, yeah, right.
at the end when the Justice Department came down, and the businessmen didn't want to be in the meeting. They didn't want to negotiate the details. And they hired these two young lawyers
Right.
to represent them. And that was also in cooperation with Burke Marshall, who was
Right.
Bobby Kennedy's assistant.
Right.
So one of the things that you've illuminated in your responses, both of you, but particular Ambassador Young, just the power of being part of organized networks that are already established. And you mentioned that as not only the National Council of Churches, but some other ways in which you're able to get access to resources. And resources include buildings, so that the movement is able to actualize its strategies. I want to move us into the 1963 acknowledgement from President Kennedy. It was 1 month after the Birmingham settlement on June 11th, 1963, that President Kennedy finally spoke to the nation in support of the civil rights movement for the first time. And I think it's important just to say that because as we will link it to some of the movement making that we have seen in the last few years, and that has continued thereafter, this kind of hesitation oftentimes of leaders to be able to understand that the critical mass and that the body politic is moving right beneath their feet, and that the need for them to be able to not only to acknowledge it, but to be able to rise up to their own leadership for the purposes of creating a more fair and just society. So in '63, President Kennedy finally spoke to the nation. One of the questions I have for you is that I just want you to think about remembering Kennedy's speech and its impact. And also, I'm just going to speed up a little bit that then that same year, in August, we all know of 250,000 people who gathered in the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the gathering near the Lincoln Memorial, which would be a very pivotal moment in our society. We're going to show a clip of an interview with you, Ambassador Young, that talks a little bit about that moment in 1963. And we're going to play the clip now, and then we're going to come back and have you respond to both President Kennedy finally making an acknowledgement in the top of the summer of '63, and then towards the end of the summer, this historic gathering. Let's play a clip of that video.
The I Have a Dream speech made the civil rights movement a homegrown American movement. Everybody wanted to make us communists, wanted to make us troublemakers, but he identified the march as a fulfillment of the American dream. It was a completion of the Constitution. It was, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And when he went into that, standing in front of Lincoln, he linked the movement back to Thomas Jefferson. That was the message. That was the message. That's what transformed a Southern Black movement into a national integrated movement. That's what brought the churches in. That's what brought the labor unions in. It brought the liberal intellectuals in. Every American could identify with that I Have a Dream speech. And he even sparked the hopes and dreams of people around the world, because from that time on, everybody knew who Martin Luther King was.
So much. So, Ambassador, would you respond and just share some thoughts that you had about just the Kennedy speech of that year in June, and then the speech that you referred to, which Dr. Clarence Jones was a contributing member of the speechwriting team. Just share your thoughts about the impact of those speeches in the country.
Well, it was not just the speeches, it was the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Before 1963, we were a Southern, predominantly Black movement. And I think that Clarence and Stanley Levison and Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph understood that we weren't going to get far as a Southern Black movement. And that in a way, they integrated us into the national politics
Mm-hmm.
with the president, but also it opened relationships with the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the National Council, what was it called? It was the gathering of all of the churches.
Yes.
Father Hesburgh from Notre Dame,
Yes.
Rabbi Abram Heschel
National Council
from the Jewish Seminary. And it brought all of the denominations, Archbishop Iacobus of the Greek Orthodox Church.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it was about that time that Bill Russell was putting University of San Francisco on the map.
I think, yeah.
And
right.
so you had a tidal wave
Mm-hmm.
of success and consciousness very similar to Black Lives Matter, only we weren't as big and we didn't have cell phones.
And social media.
No social media, but they created a national network to impact a Southern Black movement.
And that's a very important part, the national network. Go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Also, Andy, it was in June, it was a shocking assassination of Medgar Evers.
That's right.
Okay. It was June when Kennedy, for the first time, went on national television and talked about it being a moral issue. He never put the question of civil rights as a moral question before. Until then, the assassination of Medgar Evers, he forced the nation to look at itself. And he used the words, it's a moral question.
I wonder, it's almost making the link where Ambassador, I was writing your words down as you were saying it. You said it was the idea and how it got national. It became a national movement, but you said it was a tidal wave of consciousness. And then as Dr. Jones is linking the murder of Medgar Evers as being a precursor as well, so you have these events. It's almost as if you were to look at it in a 2020 lens, if someone were perhaps trying to overlay, you can see the ways in which the murder of George Floyd led to that same type, right, Dr. Jones? Maybe?
Yes, that's good. That's a good analogy.
So,
just as Dandy said, that I've often speculated, Andy just speculated, of what the power of our organizational abilities, of how they would have been magnified if we had laptops and cell phones, which we didn't.
Yeah. The thing was that there was an awakening. Now, the Kennedys, you remember Harris Warford, don't you?
Very well.
Harris Warford had been a 12-year-old Quaker kid whose grandmother took him around the world when he was 12 years old.
Right.
And he met Gandhi in Bombay, India.
Right.
As a 12-year-old. Well, he never forgot that. And when he went to law school, he went to Harvard for a year, but then he went to Howard for the second year.
Right.
And then went back to Harvard. So he always had this network of the Black community and Gandhi. He was the one, I think, that hooked up the phone call between Kennedy and Martin when Martin was in jail in 1960.
Right.
During the election.
Right.
And I think nobody in the campaign wanted Kennedy to get involved in this. But Harris Warford called Coretta, and as he told me, Jack Kennedy, the candidate, just happened to walk in the room. And he said, "Here, say hello to Mrs. King." And that was the phone call that probably got him elected.
That's correct.
Wow.
Because it was a very close election between Kennedy and Nixon.
Wow.
And say all the Black folk in the South were Republican then. And Daddy King said, in fact, I think Nixon had even been to speak at Morehouse. And Martin had been with Nixon at Ghana's independence. And so we had more links with the Republicans at that time. But when Daddy King said, "I got a suitcase full of votes," and I've never known, he said, "I worried about this Catholic boy." He said, "But seems like he got a good heart. And if he calls up my daughter-in-law to check on my son,
Mhm.
I'm gonna throw a whole suitcase full of oats in his way.
That's a great story. You know, I want to ask you, as we kind of bring this portion of the interview to a transition. There's a winter period, if you perhaps when you read Dr. King's writings and people, Dr. Jones, who I've had an opportunity to work very closely with, Ambassador Young, Dr. Clarence and I have been very close over these last few years, literally working in the same office suite. During the last year of Dr. King's life, following the Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King was often depressed. And part of, if you could maybe spend a little time talking about what it was like for you to work with King in general, to be close with him, but even to think about it during this kind of winter period of his life.
Well, it was the thing that I think that upset him more than anything else was not the fact that the FBI was snooping, was wiretapping everything and following us around everywhere. He went to meet with Ambassador Goldberg
Mm-hmm.
about, in fact, Ambassador Goldberg at the UN invited him, and I went with him, and we talked about Vietnam. When we come out, he says, the press says, "What did you talk about?" He said, "This was Ambassador Goldberg's meeting. I'd rather he report on it." And he said, well, did you talk about anything else? And he said, "I said it was Ambassador Goldberg's meeting." And finally said, "Well, what do you think about China?" And he said, you didn't talk about that, did you? Said, "No, we didn't." He said, "Well, what do you think about China?" And his answer was, well, 800 million people are not going to disappear just because we refuse to admit that they exist.
Mm.
And that simple, truthful statement got him more attacks from coast to coast. All the liberal press turned on him. Even Ralph McGill, who had been a staunch ally in the South on everything racial,
Mm-hmm.
turned. Scotty Reston of the New York Times attacked him. There was just nobody. And I think that the depression was for him how deep this racism is in America.
Yes, yes.
And that for him to have an opinion as a citizen
Mm-hmm.
that is so simple and so obviously true.
I was going to say, so true.
And then to get attacked for it. There's nothing controversial about that.
No, he's talking about people's basic humanity. Dr. Jones, you want to comment? I know you shared with me personally, but maybe share for this audience some of your reflections on that period of his life, Dr. King's life.
Well, that period was that, it's interesting. I not just me, but Stanley Levison and Harry Wachtel to a lesser extent, but Cleveland Robinson and others, we sensed that when Dr. King was going to move, particularly when the Vietnam War was going on, when he was not staying in his little civil rights box, it was a great concern to the Johnson administration. But I always tell people, Dr. King was a preacher, but he could count. He knew that there's only so much money in the federal treasury, and if so much of those monies are being spent to build bombs and bombers, there's hardly little left in the so-called Great Society program. Mm-hmm. So aside from the moral issue of the Vietnam War, he knew that the resources of the country being squandered in Vietnam meant there was no resources to address the needs domestically. So that's the combination of those things.
Mm.
You remember, Clarence, there was a picture on the front of Life magazine
Yeah.
of a little girl whose clothes had been burned off her by napalm.
Oh, God, yes.
See?
Mm.
And that picture on the cover of Life had the same impact on America and the world that George Floyd's death had.
Very good point. Yes.
You
Very
can't
good
sit
point.
there, you can't look at that and say, this is my tax money. And so Martin said the bombs is worse than that. He said the bombs that you drop on Vietnam are sinful enough, but they're going to also explode at home in inflation and unemployment.
Right, right, right.
Um,
Very good point.
Ambassador Young, you were with King. We're going to go very quickly to Memphis, if that's possible. Inviting you to think about the day you were in days you were in Memphis, and the day you were with King. You were there to support the striking sanitation workers when he was assassinated. If you wouldn't mind just sharing any thoughts you have about that moment, the funeral itself, and just the overall reaction throughout the nation.
It was something that he felt was coming on. And see, it was exactly a year to the day between that statement and the sermon at Riverside Church and the day he was assassinated. Well, we had also met with Ralph Bunche in 1967. Before we met with Ambassador Goldberg. And Ralph Bunche said, you know, I'm sorry you're right about Vietnam, but I'm sorry you got so extended. And he said, and Ralph Bunche, there were 2 assassination attempts on his life that missed. And he said, I had to learn to keep my head down, and nobody knows what I'm doing here at the UN. And he said, if they knew, I wouldn't probably last long. And so we had that discussion, and all of this was coming together. And I think he felt that his days were numbered. And that's why he wanted to push for the Poor People's Campaign, because he wanted his life to be dedicated, as he would say, to the least of these God's children. And Memphis wasn't on the list, but he could not say no to the sanitation workers. And I think we're getting closer to that again now, where we don't say sanitation workers, but we do know that a society cannot function without the essential workers, we call them.
Yes.
Well, you can't run a city if you don't have sanitary streets. And so his identification was, well, I don't know. Nobody wanted him to go to Memphis. And he didn't tell anybody he was going to Memphis. It was at midnight that Sunday night, and we didn't have to be in Washington till, 8 o'clock Monday night. And I said, you can sleep late tomorrow. And because you need some rest. He said, no, I'm going to catch the 6 o'clock plane to Memphis. And I said, what for? He said, I promised them I'd come back and march with them. I said, well, why didn't you let us know? You shouldn't be going someplace marching by yourself. And that march was sabotaged. And there were actually young people paid to disrupt the march and break windows and steal.
Yes.
And that kept him in Memphis. And we didn't think of it. We knew it was trying to stop us from getting to Washington. But I don't think anybody ever thought that it never crossed our minds that this would be, his last move.
Hmm.
But I think he was aware.
Yes. I'm going to transition us now. This is maybe my last question for us in this time that we have. And there's just so much that we can try to cover. But time is a limited thing. We want to acknowledge the death of George Shultz this week, who in your capacities would have worked with closely. And George Shultz was the Secretary of State for President Reagan, as well as father, President George H.W. Bush. And he would go on and continue an illustrious career in the United Nations. But I want to make a link now from...
Well, can I make that link for you?
Yes, please do.
Because my first meeting in Congress with the banking committee, he was Secretary of the Treasury.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked some question which Arthur Burns kind of put me down. I wasn't supposed to answer that. But George Shultz kind of felt a little funny about it. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, I go to these meetings all over the world and I don't like to go to a meeting with a delegation from the United States where everybody's white. Would you mind going with me to a meeting? So he took me to the World Bank meeting in Kenya and took me to the Inter-American Bank meeting down in the Caribbean. And he sort of picked me out. And it was difficult because I said, I could go anywhere, but I said, my wife and I have been to Jamaica before. And I said, the women and the men are so aggressive in Jamaica, she would never let me go to Jamaica alone. I can't go with you to Jamaica. And he said, well, bring her along. And I said, well, she can't come because we got a 3-month-old baby boy. And he said, well, bring the baby. My wife's a nurse. She would love to have a baby. So my son got a diplomatic passport at 3 months old.
Wow.
because George Shultz didn't want to go to an Inter-American Bank meeting with an all-white delegation.
So this
and he was serious. I mean, he followed through that everywhere he worked. He always had a mixed staff, and he consciously moved his students both at Stanford. Well, I don't know whether Condoleezza Rice would have gotten to be the advisor to President Bush were it not for his recommendation, because they were at Stanford together, but they were also on the board of Chevron together.
Interesting.
And he was just a great man who lived to 100.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. New York Times just did his obituary just recently. We're coming to a close, and I do want to make sure that we spend some time talking about the linkage of the Black Lives Matter movement today. It has galvanized this country. You stated earlier, Ambassador, that it has actually been the largest nonviolent protest in the history of the United States, particularly from May to August of 2020. The country has never seen anything like that.
But not in the United States.
Globally.
In the world.
Absolutely. So what do you think King would say about this moment right now, with particularly?
You mentioned that it was Medgar Evers' death that sparked Kennedy's speech.
Yes.
It was Bloody Sunday that sparked Lyndon Johnson's speech. I think that to sit there and have to watch a young man die for nothing for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the whole world said no. See, and it brought everybody together, younger people of all races in the streets, but behind the scenes, there has been a change in the thinking of people in big business, and especially Clarence. I've never seen Wall Street respond to an incident like they have now.
That's correct.
And I think it was Citigroup said that segregation or racism is expensive, that it costs the economy $16 trillion
Right.
between 2000 and 2020. That's almost $1 trillion a year.
Right, right.
Just like in 1963, these titans of industry are finally saying something that people have known for generations, that racism hurts and it costs us not only our humanity, but it hurts us at the very core of our prosperity. We are at time, and I just want to say it has been a pleasure to spend time with both of you. Dr. Jones, you're like a godfather to me. Thank you so much for always being with us. And Ambassador Young, this is my first time having a conversation with you, and it has been really, really wonderful. Thank you so much, and I wish we could continue talking now. I'm going to ask my colleague, Jonathan Greenberg, to join us to share some closing comments.
Thank you so much, Mary, for such a wonderful conversation with Dr. Jones and Ambassador Young. I have been immensely privileged in my life to have been the co-founder of the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice with Dr. Clarence B. Jones. Dr. King and Clarence Jones and Andrew Young practiced militant nonviolence to successfully end Jim Crow apartheid. That was a revolution in our country. And our job is to follow them, because the evils that Dr. King identified, racism, poverty, extreme inequality economically, militarism, and pervasive violence remain intractable, and we have to find a way out. One of the books that was written by Andrew Young is A Way Out of No Way. When you get to the place where the problems are intractable, we don't see the way. How do we get out? How do we find the way out of no way? And Ambassador Young's life and his work has shown that when you get to the point of crisis, failure, frustration, and there's no way out, somehow through prayer, through faith, and through disciplined, organized nonviolence, a way emerges. So our job is to learn from them, because Dr. King's warning remains true today. The choice is not violence or nonviolence. The choice is between nonviolence and non-existence. So it's my honor to present Ambassador Young with the inaugural Dr. Clarence B. Jones Award for Kingian Nonviolence on behalf of the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice. I'd like to briefly share with you some of the reasons why I cannot imagine a more deserving recipient for our Institute's inaugural Nonviolence Award. First, I'd like to show a very short video taken from interviews that we've done together with Andy Young and the marvelous team at Wondros Film.
We were not accusing anybody of anything. I mean, his idea was, look, I can't help it that I'm born black and you're born white. There's nothing wrong with me or you, but we were born into an unjust relationship. And we need to focus on changing the relationship. And I'm not trying to blame you for the relationship, but neither should you blame me. But what we've decided is we're going to take the initiative to change that unjust relationship. And we're not going to cooperate with the injustice. See, and you can help us remove that, and then we can cooperate again. He'd always call us certifiably insane to think we can change this world. But he said, we probably won't make it to 40. If we make it past 40, we can probably make it to 100. And I think that's what keeps me going. He didn't make it to 40. He was killed at 39. And so far, there's still all of the things he preached about and all of the things that I knew he was praying for and gave his life for. I got to find some way to do something about it. Now, I didn't want to be mayor. I didn't want to be congressman. I didn't want to go to the UN. Nobody else would go. So that could do, nobody had the background I had. And I think that was one of the things that we all felt, that everybody's put on this earth for something. I've never planned anything I've done, and it always has worked out right. So I have to see my life as a spiritual phenomenon. I mean, it's not that I'm smart or not that I'm lucky. It's that I followed a path nobody thought was going anywhere, but it went everywhere I needed to go. And looking back on it, I've had a phenomenal life. But if I'd not taken one of those crazy choices, see, it wouldn't have happened that way. You had to do, we used to sing a song, I'm gonna go where the Spirit says go. I'm gonna do what the Spirit says do. What the Spirit says do, I'm gonna do, oh Lord. I'm gonna do what the Spirit says do. And none of it made sense by any human standard.
Well, I have been blessed to be able to have conversations with you because as a beautiful gift to me, Clarence Jones introduced me to you, and it's been such a privilege to be able to talk with you and learn from you. I want to share just a few very brief examples for our audience of the ways that you've demonstrated the power of nonviolence in your life. You showed us the power of nonviolence education. Many people don't know about the citizenship schools that Mary referred to through the Highlander Folk School and at Dorchester through the SCLC, along with powerful leaders like Septima Clark and Dorothy Cotton, who you discussed. You transformed the South student by student. You opened the doors to men and women who were denied a decent education by the Jim Crow system that kept them illiterate and disenfranchised. You trained 1,000 local Black leaders from South Carolina to East Texas, who then became teachers in the program. And then together you empowered 100,000 people to read and write, become educated citizens well-versed in nonviolent resistance, to gain the power of the vote. One of your first recruits was the extraordinary Fannie Lou Hamer, who then galvanized the nation in her leadership of the Mississippi Freedom Party. You showed us the power of nonviolence in action over and over again in Albany and Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery, working with street gangs in the slums of Chicago. You showed us the power of love against hate, power of truth against lies, power of prayer and song against the disease of racism and violence, a power of life against death. I'd like to share one example in your practice of nonviolence that you referred to briefly in the conversation, but people may not know about what happened in St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest city in the US, and in 1964, one of the most viciously racist cities in the country, deeply entrenched in Jim Crow segregation. You were sent by Dr. King to support local grassroots community efforts to desegregate the city. There were marches to the old slave market that were peaceful and nonviolent. And you were confronted by a vicious mob of white supremacists, Klan vigilantes, and the off-duty police who supported them. They carried baseball bats and blackjacks. called out racial slurs, threatened to unleash violence against you. And then you calmly, crazy maybe, but with some inner spiritual centeredness, went to talk with them, try to reason with them, say that we want to march peacefully. And that was the time that you were beaten, you were hit by a blackjack, you were knocked unconscious. You found out later because the TV cameras showed it. And then they left you on the ground and they were sure they ended the march. And you got up and went to the group of people who were waiting and they said, let's go back, we're gonna march. We're not gonna stop, we're not gonna turn around. And then it happened again, the same thing. You went back to talk to them and you were hit by a blackjack and you went back to the community and you led the march. And you led the march the next night and the night after that. The eyes of the nation were on you. Congress was in session debating the Civil Rights Bill, and they passed that bill because they understood that the Jim Crow system in places like St. Augustine could no longer be sustained. As a congressman and as ambassador to the UN, you showed us the power of human rights, the power of internationalism, the bond between Black Americans and Africans in the emerging independent nations during the struggles of decolonization, independence and democracy, struggles that have not been completed. And the struggle for human rights remains the core struggle that we need to complete in our life. And throughout your life, as you've showed this today, often you showed us the power of faith, prayer, and the journey of nonviolence as a deep spiritual practice. The contribution you've made to freedom, justice, and equality is immeasurable. And I'd like to show everybody, this is the certificate we're gonna send to you. It's, let me read it to you. It says, this certificate is awarded to Andrew J. Young in recognition of dedicated service to our nation and humanity through the disciplined, heroic practice of nonviolence as SCLC leader alongside Dr. Martin Luther King, and as congressman, US ambassador to the UN, mayor of Atlanta, pastor, author, and lifelong social justice activist. So I can't tell you how much I love and admire you, how proud I am to present to you the inaugural award on behalf of the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to introduce the president of our university, Father Paul Fitzgerald.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Mary Wardell. Thank you, Mayor London Breed. Thank you so much, Clarence. Always so grateful. And Ambassador Young, thank you for teaching us. Thank you for enlightening us. Thank you for leading us through these most important questions that really are at the heart of the American dream and the heart of the soul sickness that is also woven through the history of this nation. I was very moved by your comments about the members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Black Church. As we all know, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was surrounded by several ordained ministers, yourself included, and of course, a lawyer, Clarence B Jones. You know, we Jesuits, we like to talk about ourselves by saying that we are sinners, yet called by God to labor for justice under the shadow of the cross. And that phrase, I think, sums up that amazing, heroic group that surrounded Dr. King through the hardest days, months, years of the struggle. And none of us are perfect, but God writes straight with crooked lines. Dr. King was able to touch the very soul of America and turn a civil rights movement from a Southern movement, a Black Southern movement, into a national movement by evoking that fundamental ancient Hebrew notion that human persons are created in the image and likeness of God, which is foundational to the dream of this country. So in this moment, you know, you call upon us as a university, the University of San Francisco, to be an anti-racist institution. Yes, we were one of the first schools to be integrated back in 1930, but we know that the struggle is far from over. And you said so many wise things, Ambassador, but quote, if you lose your temper, you lose the fight. So militant nonviolence for social justice demands amazing equanimity. It demands an ability to through love and grace and truth, to cure the soul sickness of people who don't recognize the full humanity of every person, and therefore are smashing and crushing their own humanity. And so we all acknowledge again that nonviolence takes courage and strength. And we see that courage and that strength, Ambassador, throughout the long history of your life, which has many, many chapters yet to come. So thank you for inspiring us, and thank you for allowing us to walk in your footsteps. All of you who've been watching this program, thank you so much for joining us. Please join us on February 16th for a very lively discussion, it promises to be, with San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank President, Dr. Mary Daly. This is a follow-up from our conversation with her predecessor, Dr. Janet Yellen, who was also president of the SF Federal Reserve. So please join us and take to heart everything you've heard from Clarence Jones and Ambassador Young, and let's change the world from here.
Mr. President, if I could have a closing word.
Absolutely.
And to thank you, the one story that I don't think has been told is everywhere I've been in the world, there is a previous presence of the church. And the South, it was the Congregational Church, but also the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, in Africa, when it was a compliment, but the way they used to say it was, everybody blames the communists for stirring up Africa, but it's not the communists, it's those damn Jesuits. They go around teaching everybody that they're God's children. And so I grew up in the Congregational Church, but I lived, that neighborhood I lived in New Orleans was a totally Roman Catholic neighborhood. And a number of my good friends ended up in the priesthood. And I've seen the movement of the Holy Spirit through the academic institutions, changing the world almost everywhere I've been. In fact, one of my keys to success was that I didn't just look at the reports of the State Department and the CIA. I talked to the missionaries everywhere I went, and I got a slightly different view, but I ended up learning that the changes that are occurring in this world are part of what we see in the New Testament as an evolving presence of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And of course, I didn't know until the last time we spoke of the long heritage that you planted in Clarence B Jones as a result of his work with the church and growing up in the church.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. An excellent way to wrap up this great conversation. Come back. We've got more wisdom to share. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.